Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ideas Energized webinar series from Larta Institute. We're so excited that you can join us today for this insightful webinar on the topic of public relations for science startups, pitching to the press. This is actually part 2, and it's a follow-up from last year's webinar, which focused on the power of messaging and how to communicate technical concepts to a larger audience. I would definitely encourage you all to check out that webinar in the Larta webinar archive on our portal, and it'll also be on the Ideas Energized website shortly. So leading the webinar today will be Tim Gnatek. He is a story builder, writer, entrepreneur, and award-winning communication strategist. He is the co-author of You Only Launch Once, and the co-founder and president of Blue Practice, which he will tell us more about shortly. And myself, Jelani Adlam, Programs Associate at Larta, I will be moderating. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get into the presentation. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions via the questions text box on your GoToWebinar dashboard. You can also use the hand raise function to ask questions live, and a microphone will be required for that. The webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available after the session, as well as the slides, and also any handouts that we received from today's session. And at the end, please share your feedback, take our brief survey. We always like to hear your comments and other suggestions. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim.
And thank you very much, Jelani, and welcome to everyone. I was so pleased to see such tremendous response to this, our second in the series of communications for science startups, and really as a response to a lot of the feedback that we got after that last session. We felt as though it would be very helpful to go more in depth about media relations and working with journalists. You know, it's kind of a natural stepping stone from being able to hone your own message and be able to articulate your key values and the key messages of your own organization to others, to then naturally wonder, well, okay, now that I know how to be able to talk about myself, how do I find an audience and how do I gain their ear? And in particular, media. I think that we all realize that even in a very rapidly changing media environment, journalists still remain highly respected and credible third-party validators of new technology, and are kind of entrusted by the public at large to help to understand complex topics and issues as we all deal with as those in science and in innovation entrepreneurship. So being able.
Sorry to cut you off. We are having trouble seeing your screen.
Oh, thank you. Yep, looks like that.
There we go. Okay.
Right now, great. Yeah. So as we continue to explore the benefits of working with media, we thought that it would be helpful to kind of dive a little bit deeper, answer some of the questions that came from that last session, and provide some just basic building blocks that we hope can provide everyone on the phone with a general understanding of what it takes to effectively work with the media, to kind of demystify some of that, and to just, you know, very effectively use media and media relationships as a tool for the success of your own companies. So as we kind of launch into that, maybe just briefly to talk about who we are at Blue Practice, an agency that I founded about 12 years ago, specifically focused on innovation around beneficial technologies, particularly around sustainability and technologies that can really help people and the planet overall. And we've been doing that, and in the course of doing that, have launched many companies and have, you know, built relationships with media over that period of time. And so that's been, you know, kind of our lifeblood in the course of working with that. And also just me personally have a background in journalism. Before starting Blue Practice, I was a journalist at the New York Times, writing for the business and technology sections. I was also working for Morning Edition on NPR, and was a contributor to Wired magazine. So have a fair amount of experience both in in print, magazine, web, and radio broadcast. So we'll hopefully bring a little bit of lessons in terms of those various audiences together in our session today. And particularly, again, just to hone in on this breadth of, work that we do that hopefully will inform this session, whether, your own innovations are feeding, fueling, or healing the world. We have experience at Blue Practice in knowing just the challenges that we all face as innovators in these areas, and effectively communicating those to non-experts, and how difficult it can be sometimes to take a complex topic, regardless of what sort of field it's in, and explain that to media or to the public at large in a way that's meaningful, that draws an ability for them to be able to relate and find the importance and significance of the work that's underway. So we'll dig in a little bit deeper and talk more about that. But in particular, to just kind of like circle back around to media, it's maybe worth even asking, why does it matter? It seems like it's an added complexity to add into what is already a very difficult and challenging time in a startup, very early stage, working on R&D, validating technology, building partners, seeking investment, and to think that you also have to worry about communicating to other audiences as well, and media. Can be seen as a complexity and as just as an additional hurdle to have to get over in the course of doing everything that's already on your plate. But I'm here to say that those relationships really are meaningful, and it doesn't have to be an all-at-once kind of strategy, but I truly believe that the sooner you can begin to find the value in media and begin to build relationships with even a few key media people, you will find tremendous value in that, and great return in the long run. One thing that I'll say now and will repeat over the course of this hour is that media relationships truly are relationships, and it's an opportunity to engage in a dialogue between yourself as an expert in a very particular subject matter and journalists who really are building their own careers on hoping to understand and translate technical and important information to their audiences. They need you as much as you need them, and to the point that you can create meaningful relationships with those reporters who can play that role, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. It's not necessarily just a transactional, hey, I'm going to give you a press release, you write about this, or vice versa, a reporter saying, I just want to pull all this information from you and I'm going to kind of use it as I will. We are people, they're people, and it's a relationship building exercise. And so that's really a key message for me over the course of this talk, and hopefully some of the slides that we have coming up will drill that in and provide some concrete examples of ways to help build those kinds of relationships. And ultimately, obviously, as a communications agency, we love to get involved in these projects as well, and have built our careers on an expertise around doing this. But it's not to say that you need an agency or a communications consultant to begin this. In fact, the sooner the better. And I think that building these relationships and just learning about media and the media that are in your world, the sooner you can do that, the more benefit you'll be able to bring, whether or not you decide to turn to a professional to help at some strategic point in the future of your organization. And just, I guess, reiterating that here, the relationships that you build are going to be absolutely vital, and that media are looking to establish these as soon as possible. They want to be on the ground floor of where news stories are coming up from and where key issues that might sort of reverberate beyond a small given area into other areas of impact for them. The more they know about that, the better. So how can we kind of build these bridges and begin to tell the stories that we need to in order to make those relationships happen? Well, in fact, it does all begin with the story. It begins with understanding that as you begin to think about what you want to talk about to the press, in a way, it's thinking about some very fundamental storytelling mechanics. You want to be able to create, if you think of any good story or fable that you have, there are characters, there is drama, there is a issue, there's conflict, and there's resolution, and there's opportunity. How can you begin to think about yourself and the work that you're doing in terms of these sort of fundamental story building blocks that we see over and over again? There are different kinds of elements to these stories. And so, I kind of challenge everyone or invite you to think about your own company, the technologies that you're working with, the teams that you have in place, the investors or partners or academic collaborators that you have as characters in your story. And this as an exercise can be extremely helpful in understanding how you would relate this to, especially to an audience, a non-technical and non-expert audience, which is often the biggest hurdle that we have as science-based innovators, is thinking about how do we begin to tell these stories in a way that will seem meaningful and significant to an audience that is not in the fold or necessarily up on what it is specifically that we're doing. So, so thinking about the people who are part of this story that you have already, who has contributed to it so far, where is additional relevance, and even outside of the specific kind of bubble that you may feel like you're in already, in terms of people that you're actually working with, what other factors are out there in the world today that have relevance to your own work? Certainly environmental impact, and if you are a news junkie, you'll see coverage of issues that may touch upon your area of expertise. If it's around climate change, certainly there's no shortage of climate change stories. Here, we're located in the Bay Area of California, where we're all suffering from some very serious outcome from the Camp Fire up in Paradise. Even just today, air quality is upwards of 300 parts per million of particulates in the air in San Francisco. It's a huge story, and if, say, you had a technology that was somehow relevant to air quality, this becomes a sort of a global news issue that you then have some area of expertise that you could contribute to. And that's just one example, but there are many others in the food and agriculture sector, in life sciences, in healthcare, in energy and sustainability. We're kind of constantly being inundated with news around these sectors. How do you play into those? What could you contribute to, or what kind of insights might you have that could help to inform this greater story that's being told? That's a very important point to be able to understand, to help you stand out and gain more relevance when it is time for you to pick up the phone or write an email to a reporter. So you want to be able to build all of that and understand where relevance and where the drama is. That's all kind of the internal part, and that's an exercise that we'll have some more points to talk about later. But again, as I said earlier, interacting with media is a dialogue. It is a relationship between two parties. And so you both need to understand your own story, the relevance of the technology you're working on, and the context of which that's going to be important to others. But you also want to be listening. You want to be listening to what is being told already, what is the tone and tenor of existing news coverage that's happening, and knowing specifically who are the reporters who are covering your kind of story. So, to whatever extent you can, and again, I understand that with, so many different sort of critical factors being underdone at the same time, and as, entrepreneurs, many, small and really I've built my practice in working with small, innovative startup companies. So I know all of the immense pressure and the millions of directions that you're pulled in at all times. But being able to track media and set up some very simple tools to help you do that. Google Alerts might be like the most simple and helpful. We certainly have them set up at our agency for all of the clients that we work with, just to be able to help cull and kind of bring to the surface the first thing of every day some stories based on some simple keywords that we set up so that we know where the tone is around the issues that we care about. I would certainly invite everyone to be able to do the same at the very least, to gain not only a sense of who's talking about the areas that are important to you, but also what's the tone of it, what kind of optimism or pessimism is there, what kind of underlying maybe stereotypes or biases that already exist within this space that maybe work within your favor or maybe are things that you need to try to educate against. Being really eyes wide open about the existing state of media and how your area of importance is being covered is absolutely essential to begin to have this relationship with media and begin to kind of hold their hand and take them on a journey. You want to be able to take them on a journey like that previous slide of your story, but you need to know where they're starting their journey from, and that takes a little bit of diligence and intelligence on your part to know where they're starting from so that you can take them on a journey to where you want them to go to. And ideally that's a place that that gives respect and recognition to the work that you're doing, that finds relevance in that work, and that they can effectively understand what your work is and then communicate that to other audiences. So in kind of one, we've talked about understanding the story from an internal perspective, two, appreciating where media exists already and really knowing that groundwork so that you can begin to take them on a journey. And then we kind of move to, okay, well, now we know that. Now, how do we actually engage in that storytelling process? What are some of the mechanisms that we have to be able to work on? What are some of the opportunities that we have in reaching out? When is it relevant to reach out to media? When will they pay attention to us? There are a lot of different mechanisms for doing this, and we'll go sort of pragmatically into some more detail about those a little bit later. But suffice it to say that the way in which you kind of tell this story is just as important as how you tell it, because an interesting story told at the wrong time or in the wrong context can lose that sense of importance and relevance, which is absolutely essential in working with media. I mean, news, after all, is, you can't have news without new. And so, where is the novelty in that? And being able to highlight that is absolutely critical. Now, we probably all know about the press release as a traditional mechanism of distributing information to media. And I'm still a big proponent of it. And I think that it's a smart, tried and true mechanism that's effective at being able to kind of bring together the elements of a story and telling it fairly succinctly in a page or two, with comments and color from key spokespeople or maybe a partner, a little bit of information and context. And that is a helpful tool in communicating with media. The sad reality of press releases is that there's so many press releases that are out there. So many organizations push them out. I mean, hundreds of thousands a day. That a press release alone is not enough to constitute successful media outreach. I would think of a press release more as a point of reference, as a sometimes, unfortunately, an overly formal point of reference that clearly is sort of full of corporate speak, and it's very, cleansed and purposeful. But media may like to use that as a flag for them that, hey, okay, there's something kind of interesting here. This company has decided to do a press release, so there must be something new. But quite often, media are looking for more savory bits of information than can be communicated within a press release itself. So by all means, think about a press release as a milestone, as a flag to plant in the sand that can communicate not only media to media, but to all of your constituents and your audience. And it's perfectly appropriate to post on your website, to communicate over existing social channels that you might have, and yes, to send to media that shows that there was a marked point of progress that was made by the company. But a press release alone is not enough to gain media attention. So, how can we bring more value into distributing news to media? And what do we have to be able to give them that's more? And there always is more. We'll talk about some specific mechanisms for being able to do that afterwards. But I just want to plant a seed that in addition to doing press releases, there's also the opportunity to contribute on background to media to help build their background knowledge about a particular sector that they may be towing into, but maybe not are totally conversant in yet. And you might be able to provide a very valuable service to them by reaching out and offering to give them a little bit of information or context about a particular area, kind of a soft sell rather than a hard sell of a press release. That's a great way to build long-term relationships with press. Being able to share little bits of information or comment on stories that they may already be writing about or may be about to write about, because you may know through your existing expertise in an area that there's some momentum happening in a particular facet of your own work that most likely will be covered by media. It may be worth it. That is a very valid opportunity to reach out to press and say, hey, this is kind of on the horizon, this issue that is certainly going to be coming to your attention soon. I'd love to provide some of my own sort of commentary about this if I can. Looking to be another third party that can add color and context to evolving stories. Incredibly valuable asset to media who are always looking out to build those sort of trusted relationships with others. So, in addition to just sort of the hard news, it's what other things can you do to build a true dialogue and relationship with these people, and beginning to think about reporters as people. I mean, as people who are often on very tight deadlines, can be very short and abrupt on the phone, and certainly have their own priorities and stressors about them. But at the end of the day, are people as well, and and are all about building relationships. And the most valuable connections that I've made on either side of the desk, both in my background as a journalist and as a representative of many startup innovation companies, has been to try to cultivate those trusted relationships, and then that just pays so many dividends moving forward. So please think about that in addition to just the kind of more obvious press releases that are out there. So you kind of know, now you know a little bit about some of the opportunities there might be to reach out to media. Well, who do you go after for this? And I kind of tipped my cards a little bit to this earlier about the value of researching press. Now, we on the agency side have the benefit of certain technologies and databases and tools that we subscribe to help us very quickly narrow down, of the many thousands of journalists who are out there globally, who might be the most relevant targets in a given area. But you don't need the fancy database tools and other devices in order to start down this journey. What you do need to do is be reading, be listening to podcasts, be identifying, first off, who are the most influential voices in the media for the particular sector that is most relevant to you. And you could do that again through just Google alerts. By, obviously I always feel like, looking at sort of our premier news outlets that we have in the US are great places to start that journey. Although, of course, you'll note that whether it's the Journal or the Times, or, other kind of, papers, like, and even, sort of more general, but very widespread tech publications like a TechCrunch, they take these issues on a fairly global level because their readership is very diverse. So, they want to tell very broad stories that are most relevant to the broadest audience possible, whereas there may also be highly influential media who have a much smaller audience but are extremely powerful in terms of their own reporting and research, not only influencing the people who are most relevant to you and your audiences, because after all, your key audience may not be being seen by 3 billion people. It may be that the more influential audience is a targeted scientific journal that is going to hit all of your potential partners or potential investors. And even if the circulation of that publication is only like 10,000, maybe those 10,000 people can be way more powerful for you and effective at moving your corporate mandate forward and the success of your company than a general publication or like appearing on a daytime TV show with Ellen, which might be a lot of fun to do, but will not be as strategic. So you need to spend a little bit of time thinking and looking over these media outlets and trying to understand where are the outlets that make a difference. And if you don't necessarily know all that initially yourself, it may be part of a conversation that you can have with trusted partners that you have already, asking them what kind of journals they read, what podcasts do they listen to, what blogs are they following, and make note of that and incorporate that in your own reading lists as you do every week, to better understand and know where the influencers lie. Just also kind of putting back on my journalist hat to share a little bit of context. When I was writing for the Times, oftentimes I would be in that same situation where I would need to be reporting on a story that was kind of putting me in an area that I wasn't really smart on. And in addition to trying to figure out who are some of the key players for me to interview to get smart, I would also reach out to journalists, other journalists who were in these smaller, more niche and with a higher level of expertise in a given area, and just as a professional courtesy would ask them, hey, who, I'm interested in this topic, who should I follow? Who are some of the key people that are really moving, who would be worth talking to? So journalists also use other journalists as resources as they kind of go in deeper into the onion, as a way deeper into the core. So it's an invitation to not only look to God, I really want us to be covered in the Journal one day, which is great, but maybe as a preliminary step to that, who are the biggest influencers that those reporters at the Journal are turning to in order to better inform their coverage? Because if you can find a way to build a relationship with them, you're in, because they will also advocate for you and may refer you. Also, other journalists are going to be reading their coverage. And so if you can get coverage in those smaller, more purposeful publications, you stand a much better chance as that story amplifies of being that one example that becomes a constant as a story escalates in visibility. I'm sure you can think of, as you think of stories in your own particular sector, why is this one company always referred to as kind of, like the poster child for what it is that we're doing when, when maybe we as a competitor have just as compelling a technology, or maybe even a superior technology, but they're just, is they flashy? Is it just, they some, kind of young protege executive that, just makes for a good story or whatever? That can be super frustrating. And I've certainly dealt with that situation a lot of times. Actually, I've been the beneficiary of working with a flashy company, and also, have worked for sort of a second or third rung company that is struggling to overcome an existing bias in the media to always cover one, kind of poster child. And how you can begin to address that is building these relationships and knowing that, it's very difficult to change that channel once that becomes ingrained in media, as that echoes up and up and up the chain, bigger and bigger. And you've got like an example that just becomes the exemplar for that space. Working early on and working with more niche reporters gives you the best opportunity to be shown at least in an equal light to others in your space, and then be able to differentiate on real valid differentiation points, and not just, well, this company is kind of validated because it's already been covered a few times. So lazy journalists, there, I said it, there are lazy journalists. A lazy journalist will just take a pre-vetted example that someone else has written about and just use them because it's easy, right? We want to try to avoid that and make sure that you get the best chance possible to get that attention. So start early, start in the sort of inner sanctum, and get ready to work your way up the chain. In terms of actually beginning that dialogue, and this can be a fairly challenging and fairly daunting process, especially if you're not used to communicating with others, is, how do you begin this journey? And maybe this is a plug as well to refer back to our first session that we did last year that talked a little bit more about honing your message and being able to effectively communicate the key messages of your company, of your technology, succinctly and powerfully. Certainly that's important. But, again, and here it is reiterating once more these aspects about, why trust really matters, and building these relationships, and how you want to be that source for media. So it's a difficult thing to do, but really the onus is on us as much as it is on the journalist to be able to make sure that we can effectively communicate that story and build excitement. But secondly, is when you get that interest from a reporter, to make sure as best as you can that you are going to be covered accurately. It's one of the more painful experiences in working with companies, is when you go through all of this sort of hard-fought process to build the relationship, to pitch the story, to gain the interest, to have an interview, and for the coverage to come out and they get the story wrong. They flub it. They misrepresent what it is that you're doing, or they mischaracterize the essential parts of the technology that you're doing. Somehow the story just misses the mark, and it's terribly frustrating, and it brings to one of these real challenges that we have in this relationship that we build with media, which is, as much as we build bridges between ourselves and the media, there is a wall in between us, and it's an important wall, and we've seen this sort of play out on the national stage so much in terms of the sort of heightened conflict between government and media recently. Is this this insistence that media remain independent and be able to tell its own story, and that's a fundamental aspect of our democracy, is that the media can be independent and not in the pocket of any one, particular organization. So we want that independence, because on the good side of that, what it does is ensures this validation, this credibility, this sort of halo effect that we can get from getting news coverage that, let's face it, can't compare with an advertisement. Like, if you could choose whether or not you're going to have a full page ad in a paper, or a full page glowing story being written, the story is going to have way more credibility and way more value to the audience than something that is obviously a paid for plug. So I mean, that's the good side. The challenge, though, is that the press don't always get the story straight, and especially when you're talking with reporters who are not sector experts, who are not working at trade journals or scientific journals, or there's no kind of peer review, there's no historic knowledge of a sector to be able to rely on. You're kind of wading in dark waters, and it can be very tricky, and and the risks begin to show themselves about how can we make sure that media are going to communicate effectively and accurately about the work that we're doing. So it's a caveat that we don't get to proofread the stories that are written by media, and I would say, like, there are very few exceptions. It has happened to me in the past. I've had very gracious reporters, and most often this is in more of the trade journal, sort of that smaller sphere, where the press are willing to share a draft, or maybe it's not a draft of the whole article, but it's a segment that maybe there are some quotes that they'll share, just to make sure, hey, we want to make sure that we quoted you correctly in this section, or I want to make sure that I'm characterizing your technology effectively and accurately. Is this correct? You will really never get the opportunity to vet an entire story and see whether or not you like it or not. They certainly wouldn't want to give that power over. But one, as much as possible, when you enter into that stage of a relationship of coverage with media, to certainly ask for or invite, hey, I'd be happy to look over, the story, or if I can help, check anything over, I'm more than welcome to. So by all means, be prepared to put that offer out to help further that story and make sure that it's accurate. But just know that you're not going to be able to proofread that at the end of the day and ensure that it sounds good to you. Secondly, is even before that step happens, the value of more kind of communications tools that you have at your own disposal, the value of being able to have a really good one-pager that you're put together that maybe describes your technology in detail, some imagery and graphics that you might be able to use to help to effectively share and tell that story to media, who are also, by the way, extremely hungry for more assets to use in their coverage. So if you go through the trouble of having an infographic designed, or maybe it's just a tech rendering of your, if it's a kind of a machine or process or something like that, any kind of visual stuff, more often than not, press love to use that because they're short-staffed. They don't really have art departments or people to be able to do this on their own. And the more of your own information that you can supplant within the press, one, the more likely that it'll be shown, and two, you'll be making sure that the materials that you have created have the best chance of appearing in those outlets. And that's stuff that you do have control over. Whereas you might not be able to control the exact words that a reporter says. But if you've got maybe there's some great photos with a caption associated with it, all that kind of stuff is really valuable. And as you kind of begin to move towards news-making opportunities that are a little bit more traditional, like a launch or introducing a technology or something, the more assets that you can build up to help tell that story, the better. So remember that. Typically I would also kind of invite more more of a discussion when it comes to actually work on some of the details around a media training before an opportunity to speak to the press, to really workshop, how can I respond to certain things? How would I answer certain questions? Now, you may not have the benefit of working with an agency to do that, but if you are thinking about getting on the phone with a reporter, take the time to think about what are the questions that I really want to what are the questions that I really want to be asked, the softball questions. And also go through and make a list of the questions that you really just don't want to be asked, like they'd be really uncomfortable or maybe would underscore some shortcoming or weakness in the organization or in the technology. And at the very least, be confident in being able to address any hardball questions that come up, and know how you might be able to segue them to a softball question. This is probably fodder for a whole nother webinar that we can do in the future about, real media training basics. But, maybe that's, suffice it to say, know what you'd want to say to the press before you get on the phone with them. Know what you wouldn't want to say to the press. Certainly don't volunteer any information to the press. Think of everything as being on record. And it's really best practice, even if you agree to something being off the record, still consider that on the record. There is no law that says that if you agree that something be off the record, that it can't be off the record. It's really just a friendly agreement that's being made, and it's really based on the quality of the relationship that you've been able to build with that reporter up to that moment when that question or when that's addressed. We say, hey, but off the record, can you tell me this? And I kind of leave that into your own hands to assess. I've certainly been comfortable being in that situation before, but only with reporters who I have a tremendous relationship with, and I trust them because the value of the long-term relationship is far more worthwhile to them than being able to sling some gossip that I might be able to spill about something in one given time. And that's probably the same as any relationship that you might have with anyone. So, tread that water carefully, but do know that, off the record is kind of a flag, and I would be very careful in that kind of situation. So lots to think about there, but, as long as you're kind of, thinking about all that stuff ahead of time, you should be fine. So let's dive in quickly, and I know that sort of time is ticking on here, so I want to make sure that we can get to all this and some questions ahead of time. Some of this I mentioned already, and just sort of in respect for the time, I'm going to just kind of skirt over some of this a little bit. But, we did talk about the press release as a sort of a tried and true mechanism that I don't want to abandon with anyone. But do know that there are some great opportunities for bringing out press releases, and that they're not only mechanisms to communicate with the press, but they're also, real sort of monuments to the own corporate growth. So, things like emerging from stealth mode, first announcing yourself, new products, management team hires, rounds of funding, all these things are significant events in the history of a company that are worth press releases. But think about other things that you might be able to do as well. And certainly, we would be out of a job if all we did was just look to do press releases. So we find lots of other ways to engage with media and make sure that we can continuously bring value to them, whether that's through offering to write an opinion piece, and which is an incredibly popular option right now for all of you to think about. As media has shrunk and journalists are burdened with more and more responsibilities and less time, and similarly, news organizations, particularly online, are getting most of their revenue from click-throughs, from visibility on pages. They're hungrier and hungrier for more content. And so they are offering more than ever now the opportunity to contribute articles to a publication. Of course, you're giving them free writing and probably keeping a reporter out of work by giving them free content. But there's a huge upside for us, which is being able to tell a story in exactly our own words and in exactly the way that we want to say it. Now, sure, these have to be written. They can't be just pure out advertisements. You got to bring a little bit of sensibility to writing an opinion piece or contributing an article about a particular topic. But they certainly can help to elevate your own thought leadership and bring you more recognition that you can help parlay into further opportunities down the road. I mentioned doing stuff on background in the past, and that's also great for working with press who are kind of dipping into a new area and are most likely just ill-informed but hungry for more information so that they can be effective and accurate with their own reporting. Never had more anxiety in my life than writing stories for the Times in an area that I was not super comfortable in, dipping into a new technology and feeling like, oh my God, I know I'm going to get something wrong and I'm going to have 1,000 people complaining to my editor that I screwed up something basic. So, to be able to have a resource for myself who could say like, hey, I'm happy to just, fill you in on information. Don't even, you don't have to quote me on this stuff right now. I just want to be a help to you. Like that as a gift to a reporter is so invaluable. And sure enough, when it came time for me to actually do something else in a space, and there was a way I could pull in someone who I trusted as a source, I absolutely would. And whether that was covering their company or whether it was quoting them as an expert in an upcoming piece, I absolutely would, because I had built up that level of trust with them. So please think about that as an opportunity, because I think that it's huge benefit for everyone. All right, so now I'm going to move on to a few case studies, and I want to try to give at least 10 minutes or so for questions. I feel like we've got some coming up, so I'm going to go through these fairly quickly and maybe just underscore. Hopefully this can just help to reiterate some of these lessons that I've talked about and ways that we've engaged, so that you can just kind of see some of the results that we've been able to have through some of them. So real quick, launches. This was a great launch that we did for a biofuel company that was using some early on synthetic biology tools to essentially reprogram E. coli bacteria to process sugars and kind of excrete an oil-like substance that could then be further processed into oleofactants, into fuels, into all different kinds of products that could enter into the market. And it was kind of wonky, and it was it was a technology that was interesting. But what really made it pop, it was the poop. If you look at the headline there, we worked together. Now, it was actually, this is a clip here from CNN, but it was with The Guardian in the UK, and working with the author of a piece there where we kind of stumbled upon this as an idea, which in some eyes maybe oversimplified the process, but made it, so to speak, highly digestible to the audience, and really catapulted this from a very niche topic into something that really became kind of a phenomenon. I mean, we got an incredible amount of coverage and did a lot of broadcasts. Hits on this, as well as, we had, CNN came to the office. We, Fox TV, we had pretty much most of the major broadcast outlets wanting to cover this because of the catchy headline, because also of the relevance. And I talked earlier about like kind of tying into the relevance. When we did do this, we were in the middle of a major fuel crisis, and gas prices had hit their all-time high. So it was also the timeliness of being able to offer even a potential solution. And of course, the reality was this technology was many years from true realization, but the fact that it offered promise to a problem that was hitting everyone and everyone could find the relevance in it was the key to really making that a success. So maybe that's enough to be said for this one. Trend stories, and this is another great way to be able to insert yourself into a story. We're currently working with a private fusion energy company, and what we've noticed in recent times, maybe just over the last sort of year and a half or 2 years, is there has been a explosion, no pun intended, of fusion energy private companies in a space that has historically always been just kind of more R&D focused from government or intergovernmental efforts. Kind of looking at this more from an academic perspective. Somewhat suddenly, at least seemingly suddenly, there are about a dozen private companies that are actually trying to commercialize around the opportunities for fusion. Now, of course, no one has yet fully proven the viability of their technology to actually successfully create a sustainable fusion reaction and get electrons onto the grid. But the fact that there is enough momentum and investor dollars flowing into this space has made it a trend. And so by understanding that this is now somewhat of a current theme within media, and that we're seeing these stories kind of popping up over and over, by strategically reaching out to all of the media who are most likely to cover this as a story as it evolves, and making sure that we can provide those press people with background and information about the particular company that we're working with and what differentiates them from the rest of this cadre of companies. We have done a pretty good job of ensuring that every time this topic is covered, our client is covered in it as well. And even surprisingly now, whether or not we directly work with the media for these stories, some of these are popping up and we haven't even worked on them, but we've done a good enough job of becoming one of those go-to poster children for this space, that we are now just constantly being referred to in every story that's coming up. And as this space continues to escalate, we expect to continue to be among that fold. And so that's just kind of a testimonial to getting in early, helping to be seen as the exemplar in a space, and then kind of reaping the rewards over time. Of course, you need to maintain those relationships to keep in that fold, but the benefits are tremendous. And just thirdly here, on the thought leadership side, again, this is the opportunity for contributing articles, for offering op-eds and other kinds of content, which is tremendously effective. This was a piece that we had gotten into the journal Nature, kind of a counterintuitive article, and that's maybe what I wanted to kind of offer as maybe just a thought about these thought leadership stories that can be done. So, here we were able to convince the board at Nature to entertain an article from a client of ours who's somewhat of a recognized thought leader already, but on a counterintuitive idea, which is that carbon is not the enemy. And of course, this is a response to the stereotype that carbon has of being bad, and the twist that we sold Nature on, and that we built this whole story around, was that it's not that carbon is bad, it's that where it is is bad. So carbon in the atmosphere is very bad, but carbon in the soil is terrific. If we could only build more carbon in the soil, we would be building healthier soils. We would be actually improving our sustainability, and that would be a positive impact rather than a negative one. So a sort of twist of thinking can often be captivating enough to bring new light to an area that's already, experiencing a lot of attention, and offer an opportunity to stand out. So, as you think about ways that you might be able to offer some of your own leadership in thought, think not only about kind of bringing yourself forward in the work that you do, but think about ways to offer maybe a little twist on what might be the expected the expected way to think about a particular issue. And that is very captivating, it's very sticky, and it brings tremendous amount of attention. So maybe consider that as you move forward. We are maybe just a pause for a second and check in with Jelani. How are we doing on time, and do we need to stop right away?
We don't need to stop, Tim. If you are able to stay on the line for another 5 to 10 minutes after so we can take questions, we're happy to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to, just because I know that I love to address questions, and just would also volunteer myself if anyone wants to follow up after this call. I'd be happy to have a follow-on conversation, and my contact info is here, and it's also through Larta. But
great. And if anyone has to leave the session, just enter your question and we'll be sure to address it and follow up with you offline.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, because just before I do end, I think it is really important to touch on social media. Of course, this is sort of the other side of media, and we've all, for better or worse, have inherited this this sort of three-headed monster of social media, which has been so beneficial in so many ways, and also so distracting, and in some cases destructive. But how does social media play into the greater media landscape? Is it relevant for journalists and in working with journalists? And what sort of efforts should you consider to telling your own story directly through the powers of social media versus or in conjunction with telling these stories in collaboration with traditional media? And there's definitely a way to work both of those in. So let's maybe just kind of dive in pretty quickly in that. One, I guess that just in short, journalists refer to social media just as much as everyone else does. And as it's become, this flood of information, it's not only become a primary source of research for journalists, but also a way that journalists engage with us and with one another. So, we have plenty of DMs over Twitter with reporters as we do sending emails or phone calls. And it's, that as a communications tool becomes a matter of knowing how media interact and what's the most effective way to reach out to them, and making sure that you can be present in that communications mechanism so that you're communicating in the landscape that they are existing within. There's, I love being able to pick up the phone and calling a journalist. I feel like you get so much further with the ability to do that than you do with just an email or sending out a tweet or something like that. But that's not to say that that's the only way to do it. And that a phone call in conjunction with an email, in conjunction with some social posts, create a sort of a larger outreach mechanism where you're hitting people in multiple different points, because sometimes it takes 3 or 4 different touch points in order to break through to someone. And we like to take advantage of all of those as much as possible. So think about that. And there are certainly a lot of different things out there. And here's where I often will get into a conversation with with a company whose eyes begin to bug out. They're like, "You're kidding me! There's so many platforms. Which ones do we choose, and how do we do it?" And this, of course, is like not even a tenth of all of the platforms that are out there to think about. But what I wanted to kind of quickly express here is that there are pros and cons of every different platform, and I think that what it takes is going all the way back to earlier in this discussion when we're talking about listening and knowing where the audiences are that you're engaging with, and then being a contributor and a conversant part of that platform is really the answer. So, like, look at all these Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and blogs and YouTube and Instagram. Like, yeah, there's tons of traffic there, and most likely there's tons of overlap in that as well. I mean, I would venture to say that everyone on LinkedIn is also on Facebook. The question is, when those people are on Facebook, are they attuned to the messages that you're going to be sending, or are they just fixated on what, photos of what someone ate for dinner last week, cats, kids, and the margarita that they had at their vacation in Aruba, so Facebook, and that's not to like completely throw Facebook out the window, because there are some really great uses of Facebook, and even we with Larta have had tremendous success. At the Ag Innovation Showcase that we had back in September, we used Facebook Live because the technology for live streaming in Facebook is amazing. And some of the other competitors are kind of coming up and trying to step in and match that, but at least at the moment, it's pretty difficult to compare with just how easy and seamless it is to do live video on Facebook. So we did it on Facebook, but we did it in conjunction with other outlets. So we were posting on LinkedIn, where we knew that there was more of a sort of a purposeful audience, where the audience was already like really plugged in and attuned to what we were up to. And we were promoting our Facebook Live event on LinkedIn. So, we're trying to optimize each platform to where it can be the most purposeful. And there's lots of, different pros and cons, and you can see some of those here. But I invite you to consider, one, absolutely put in the effort as however you can to be able to tell your own story. This is going to help directly communicate with the audiences that are most important to you. It's going to provide sort of a breadcrumb trail of information from you that will eventually be referenced by media, and it comes directly from you. You're able to share so much more information and point to people. Tesla has been a great example of, when there have been errors in the media, or at least perceived by Elon as errors in media, he's been extremely vocal on his own blog to try to, well, I don't want to say retaliate, but to rebuff errors in the media with tons of data points. There's a great example that happened in the New York Times a few years ago when Tesla was building out its supercharger network on the East Coast, and the Times assigned a reporter to drive a Tesla from, I believe it was from Florida to DC or something, testing out this supercharger highway. And of course, the reporter ran out of charge, and the vehicle had to be towed. And it, it was a big photo in the paper of the Model S being towed, and it was the story about how it was ineffective and everything. And of course, Elon had access to all of the data from the car. It was all being communicated back to their servers, and they could see that the dude forgot. He never charged his car up the night before. This was like a road trip, so he had just horrible practice as an EV driver, and was almost intentionally created the drama of running out of charge in order to create a good story. So Tesla was able to use that data. They created an extremely detailed blog post that totally outed this reporter, And it was extremely effective at being able to counter the media. So, that's just, that's one example, but the power of having a blog, being able to share your own information with your own voice and validate what it is that you do is extremely helpful. And because it's online, everyone can see it. So it becomes a key point for communications. Consider all these. I'm not going to go through them all in detail. I'm happy to do that afterwards or through Q&A. But know where your audience engages and find them there. Lastly, when should I call a PR agency? I'm going to say it's in about 5 minutes. My number is at the end of this call. No, I'm only kidding. Maybe just to know that there's a lot that we do as an agency that can help even further these points about how to effectively engage with media, how to effectively tell your own story, and how to make sure that there are sort of milestones and goalposts along the way to make that a really effective ROI so that you can see progress and attention building. And these are just some of the areas in which we most often engage, particularly with early stage companies who need to either help to identify their own story, and this is like some of the things that we talked about last year in our first session in this series, about telling the story, which is a little bit more about telling the story and I guess audience. And both of those are things that we hopefully addressed a little bit today in terms of figuring out how to tell stories, what kind of content to put together, how to interact with media, knowing when's the most appropriate time to do so, and making sure that we do that in a way that not only helps, in the moment, but builds that relationship that you'll have with these people, hopefully over years and years and years. I look back at my career both as a journalist and as a PR professional, and I've worked with people, journalists, who've started as like little cub reporters and have grown to incredible positions of power in sort of the in the media world, editors in chief and managing editors of Fortune magazine, and like these are people who were my classmates when I went to journalism school 15 years ago, or people who I had worked with who were just young reporters dipping into a story and took the time to build a relationship with them. And those relationships honestly are one of the things that we value highest as an agency. One of the things that's hardest for anyone else to kind of jump in and rebuild is the value of that relationship. And so if you can cultivate some of those yourself, I feel like you are going to be successful. So we've got some handouts. This is just kind of a quick reminder here, but there are some PDFs that we have that are available as kind of a leave behind or a reminder of some of the key takeaways of this session. I hope that they can be helpful in referring to in the future to just kind of remind yourself of some of the things that we've talked about today. And can help you be much more effective. Again, I know how challenging it is being an early stage startup company, particularly in science and technology, and having super exciting but sometimes difficult ideas to communicate. And I hope that this can be a helpful starting point for all of you. I welcome your questions. I'd love to be able to jump into some of those as we can. Or again, happy to take any of this offline with anyone. And thank you so much for joining. I really do appreciate it, all the interest that we had in the attendance of the session today, and look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for sharing your PR expertise and your thoughts with us today. It's been really valuable. And now we're going to jump right into the Q&A portion. Just as a reminder, if we are not able to address your question over the webinar, please still submit it to us, and we will we'll take it offline and we will follow up with you. So the first question we have here is, how should I reach out to a journalist? So whether this is cold calling, cold emailing, over Twitter, and any specific examples of how to go about building relationships with media partners in our field.
Well, I think that like I mentioned, calling is fantastic because it may take a little while to get someone on the phone, but when you do, you have their full attention, and you don't have their full attention if it's an email or a tweet or whatever. You're kind of competing with a lot. However, what I really like to do in my own practice is save that phone call for maybe the third point of contact or the second point of contact. I find it helpful to seed some information, either typically through an email, as an introduction, but also with a little bit more information. I'd say like probably 60–70% of the time, the reporter may not even see that email, but it's in their inbox. And then when you make a phone call, you can say, hey, I sent you an email a couple days ago, and I just wanted to follow up on that. Well, that's kind of a trick, if you will, or a tool to be able to enter into that conversation, say, I sent you some information, I haven't heard from you. So that, is kind of a flag for that person to listen a little bit, because maybe they had missed a communication and they want to know a little bit more. Or they may just say, oh, okay, thanks. I'm going to go back and take a look at that, and and I'll get back to you. So then maybe you send them another reminder. But I think that, calling directly is awesome, and I appreciate the sort of willingness to go there, because so many people don't these days. But it's a little bit difficult to do that without much background in the space. Now, if I was reaching out to someone who I had already a relationship with, or who I had noticed had already been writing a ton on the space, and I didn't feel like I necessarily needed to seed that information before picking up the phone, I would just pick up the phone and call them. Yeah, so I would do it that way. And same goes for, say, reaching out over Twitter or another platform like that. That's a nice kind of way to start a conversation, but I feel like it's the phone call that can really help to push it through. Sometimes it doesn't require a phone call too. I mean, sometimes people will respond to emails, and they will respond to a tweet or something like that too. But yeah, so I would just kind of think about it that way, maybe.
Okay, great. So our next question is, what is a reasonable retainer price range for a startup engaging with a boutique PR agency? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of a range. Retainer-based relationship. I mean, you want to be able to look at the kind of needed services that you're going to have, and I understand that a lot of, especially startup companies, are a little constrained in terms of budget. In the sort of the full service agency like ourselves, and able to work at an agency, and I'll just say, kind of by and large, and knowing sort of the industry standard as a retainer, you're looking at kind of a minimum of $8,000 a month, and more like a $10,000 retainer. Or if you can think about it, it's more like say a $100,000 to $120,000 per year retainer that you would want to set aside for the kind of deep engagement that you would want to expect out of a relationship. That would include both strategic, kind of planning, and opportunities to actual execution on a number of different endeavors that you might have. And that's, not just sort of seeing through individual press releases and stuff like that, but creating creative campaigns and engagement strategies, maybe helping to run events, or elevating exposure at strategic shows or conferences, helping to get you on stage and speak at strategic events where there's going to be extra visibility that you might have. So being able to both plan and execute on that over years, that's about what agencies look to, and up, I should say. Like larger agencies and more involved efforts can be significantly more, 200 to 500K per year. But there are also sort of more cheaper, more affordable ways to engage with PR professionals. There are contractors out there who don't necessarily have the strength of a full agency to rely on, whose ability to engage may be more limited, but might be more affordable in a short term in being able to just do some smaller strategic piecemeal projects. So that is something to consider. Some agencies, like, occasionally will work on a project basis with clients who, we feel are tremendously exciting, and that there's a great upside and opportunity to kind of get in early if it were and to work below a traditional retainer, because it's well, for us too, because we're a mission aligned organization. We like to work with companies and organizations that are promoting the kinds of solutions that we want to advocate for. So that can be a reason for us to kind of entertain relationships that might not normally fit within the parameters of our agency, or we may work on a standalone project that might be enough to kind of address some short-term needs, be an opportunity to kind of test the waters, and then open the door for a longer-term arrangement down the road. But that's about what you'd be looking for that kind of thing.
All right, great. So these are our last two questions. Again, any other questions that come in, we'll follow up with you offline. So the next one, how can I use the press to draw in prospective customers, and what about potential investors?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, both are going to be reading media. So, you want one to be able to find the right outlets who are going to target that. I think when I think about using the press to draw in prospective customers or potential investors, what speaks to me about both of those audiences and what they would be looking for is validation and sort of the opportunity that a particular technology or solution can be able to provide. So if you were looking to, say, solicit more interest from customers or investors, the kind of stories that you would be wanting to put out there is how your particular endeavor creates more value and opportunity, either to solve problems of customers or to create additional market opportunity for investors. So I think it's all about focusing on the technology at that point and drawing connection between what you do and the relevance of what you're doing to these key audiences. It's difficult to be super specific giving the generality of the question, but I think that that's going to be true regardless. Looking for how you can draw relevance and significance for what you're doing in areas that are already identified as being of interest, trending issues, trending stories, where the opportunity has already been identified by media. How can you find a way to plug into that story and make yourself more visible? And that's the kind of question that I would be asking in order to make that happen. Also, obviously, looking for tie-ins with milestones that you may have on the horizon, whether that is unveiling a new technology or a new partner or something like that. Always kind of asking these same questions. How can I make this potential announcement more appealing to these key audiences? I think just asking that question is a really smart way to begin thinking about how you would build out a strategy. Always kind of having the audience first and thinking about what is it that they are attuned to hear, what do they want to hear, and how can I kind of fit in with that receptivity that they already have. And if you can kind of slip in to that opening, then you're able to tell your story and kind of emphasize yourself more positively to them.
All right, great. And our last question, for those going the traditional route, what are the characteristics of a good header for a press release?
Catchy for sure, but I would caution about being too catchy or splashy or fluffy with them, because a header or the title for a press release, the press release is a somewhat formal mechanism of an announcement of your company. So I mean, you want the header of that press release to also reflect your own brand identity and the principles of your brand. So if you're a serious company, you don't want a fluffy headline of a press release. So how you need to think about walking that balance. You certainly want it catchy, but you might not want it fluffy or you're trying to trick someone by drawing them in with a headline that manipulates them at all. I would say it's look at the nut, right? I mean, like the first paragraph of that press release should have the most important information that you're trying to communicate, so that even if a reporter was only to read the first 3 sentences of your release, they should get the story. So from that, those 3 sentences, if you were able to turn that into 1 sentence, what would be the most powerful way to string all that together into 1 sentence? And that may be emphasizing, say, if it's a funding amount, it's the dollar amount, or maybe who the lead investor is, if that's a real name brand entity that you have, or addressing, if you're able to address a key problem in the industry with a technology, hitting that right up front. You have to think about what is going to catch the attention of someone in that press release, while, in my opinion, also kind of being cognizant of the fact that the release is somewhat reflective of the company. So I would, caution about how that's perceived. Now, like if that press release is then being issued, or you're going to like share that press release, like what we would do is we would have a press release from a client, and then we would email that press release to reporters to kind of give them a heads up. The email subject line of that message might be a little more catchy or a little more, sizzly than the headline of the press release. I would worry more about the sizzle there than in the press release. Just make sure that the most important information and the most notable information is up front. And I'd say that's a pretty good rule to go on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tim. It's been great to have you back on the webinar series, and many thanks to you and the team over at Blue Practice. For those that are still on the line, please share your feedback with us in the survey following the webinar. We love hearing your feedback, your thoughts on the webinar, and also any thoughts on additional topics you'd like to see in the future. And please check out the Ideas Energized blog and podcast at ideasenergized.com. So Tim, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think that's about it. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for sticking around a little longer than we had planned. I loved having the opportunity, and again, do welcome connecting with any of you in the future, and good luck in all of your endeavors.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks again, Tim, and have a great day.